Games are malleable. Like any for-profit medium, they change in response to the zeitgeist, and the zeitgeist for modern MMOs is that of beleaguered capitulation, the collective admittance that innovation has failed. This genre ceases to produce novelty, and that is abundantly clear when we take into consideration its most popular titles, World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV, mirror images in a funhouse. Meanwhile, games like Oldschool Runescape, nipping at the heels of, or even more popular than Final Fantasy XIV, are, at a glance, time machines into a bygone era. As a result of this explicit reality, we are fed a genre insecure with its nature, something I have at this point waxed on and on about in my prior essays. This insecurity manifests as a misbegotten philosophy, wherein MMOs contort their bodies in such a way as to break every bone in an effort to fit the image of something they will never be. Approachable, short-form experiences that quote-unquote respect your time. While there are MMOs that claim to do this, they are much less MMOs in the traditional sense, and more so MMOs in the secondary or even tertiary function. Their most sought after and beloved features are opposed to the genre, not beneficial to it. Instanced content, single-player storylines, arbitrary time gates, shackling players to under-designed systems. And when no time gates exist, just the shallow, festering skeletal corpse of hollow content is splayed out for all to see, and this is often excused as good, because for a paltry $15 a month, you can pay to log out when the game demands. So what does all of this look like in practice? Well, what genres are currently popular and how are modern MMOs trying and failing to match those expectations? The irony is that historically, MMOs are the progenitors of live service games. And those studios which began to ape this live service function took over MMOs in popularity through short-form content delivery mechanisms, allowing aspiring players to hop in at a moment's notice without requiring a huge pre-existing time investment. This is the seasonal architecture. And now MMOs are aping that. They are mimicking functions that were born from mimicking them, a perverted game of telephone wherein every time this function is replicated, it becomes less and less functional. And this is of course even more damaging in the skin of a massively multiplayer online game. Shifting an ever-evolving game world into a seasonal paradigm is questionable at best because it seeks to eliminate or at least grind down the most recognizable and important features of the genre. If you are interested in an extended analysis of this subject, stick around. If you want to watch my unfiltered experience within the recent seasonal Oldschool RuneScape game mode, then you can find that in the description or on my channel, because a solid portion of this video will be discussing different games in relation to the concept of seasonal game modes prior to breaking down RuneScape's own incarnation. Seasonal game modes have always interested me, especially in MMOs, because they are seemingly so antithetical to the genre, yet they are the primary directive. If we are to look at World of Warcraft, we can immediately understand the appeal.
We must answer.
So much chaos and destruction.
An expansion releases and over the course of 2 years, now just under 2 years, receives around 3 large updates and a host of intermediary, smaller patches. Each one of these large main updates acts as a soft reset to the entire concurrent system. Everyone, regardless of where they ended the prior patch, whether that be at the peak of their power or newly leveled, gets to experience immediate power growth in the form of catch-up systems meant to replicate the feeling of progression over the course of a weekend. All of the previously earned rewards are devalued in favor of repeating the cycle, reigniting the addictive flame of chasing the next upgrade. And this comes in the form of the same kinds of engagement archetypes: raids, dungeons, overworld slop, and perhaps, if the players are so lucky, a small novel system that gets forgotten about in the next main update. This is a conscious form of development. It's not a mistake that the game operates in 6-month increments. The intent is to make it approachable. If you are a returning World of Warcraft player or just aspiring to download the game, you really don't have to wait long to start fresh alongside your peers. The only thing you lack is game knowledge, but time investment from a character-driven perspective is a thing of the past. And all of this is known or at least felt by the players. That's what makes seasonal game modes so interesting. The knowledge that everything other than paltry and forgettable cosmetics are utterly lost after the increment winds down. This loss is of course theoretical in some cases, as you don't literally lose the gear on your character, but its purpose is muted by the new power scale introduced. This simplistic cycle seems to be perfect for theme park MMOs, since this kind of subgenre is already simple. It's a closed loop that takes place in what is often a very small sliver of a much larger world, rendered relevant by it being the newest content, and rendered irrelevant when a newer piece of content is introduced. Yet, I always felt disconnected to it. I played World of Warcraft for many years, at a high level no less, and have played or at least tried to play about every other MMO that's currently popular, and at every turn this seasonal structure, while perhaps addicting for a week, is also missing things that I never really considered until I finally gave up on it. I, surprisingly, actually want to keep the shit I've earned. It's my shit. Let me have it, and let it actually be of value. These emotions all came to a head when I quit and started playing Oldschool Runescape, a middle-aged awakening of sorts wherein I finally saw the value in a curated sandbox MMO. The features of permanence imbued so much worth in my experience and allowed the game to ask more of my time without my time ever feeling particularly infringed upon. That's the joy of actually having agency and not having my progress diminish every half year. Now, cue my surprise when I hear about leagues. For those who don't know, Leagues is a seasonal game mode, a fresh start for all paying members of the game, where they can create new characters and play Oldschool Runescape again, but with a twist. There have been 5 iterations of this game mode so far, releasing every year or two, with each one introducing a more expansive and unique shift in playstyle and an explosive bump in player count. What started as a game mode where every player gains expedited experience and drop rates locked to the at the time newest continent became so much more. Now, in its 5th incarnation, League's Raging Echoes, we see Jagex for the first time take on a more additive approach for this game mode, using their pre-existing understanding of curated sandbox systems and applying that iterative design to this limited time game mode. This was done by using the blueprint for the prior league, Trailblazer, which saw players pick up to 3 regions to unlock within the game alongside a talent tree system in the form of relic powers, granting players large boons as they progress. But Jagex didn't just run it back, they implemented a host of larger, more game-changing alterations. Combat masteries, for example, a separate talent tree for combat specialization, granting players an awe-inspiring amount of power while also allowing them to utilize new and old relics from prior leagues as well. They also implemented echo versions of certain bosses, 1 per region. Each echo fight was either sporting new mechanics or was fundamentally reworked from the ground up, as well as having a chance to drop new and bespoke items that granted more power than just about anything else. These additions were at once transformative and telling. Jagex, understanding the success of the prior league, doubled down in an effort to translate a surprise success into a runaway one. But why does it work? What about Leagues works as compared to, say, World of Warcraft? Both are limited time, short form, and exceedingly flitting. But only one is growing. The only way I was going to find out was by playing. And play I did, a lot, actually. My group Iron Man partner and I decided to jump into Leagues without guides in an effort to fully enrapture ourselves in the systems that are so highly regarded by the fans of Oldschool Runescape. And what we discovered was a deeply addicting, understandably flawed, and incredibly transformative experience. The success of leagues is as much dependent on understanding the context of old-school RuneScape and its systems as it is on simply being fun to play, but I'm getting ahead of myself. RuneScape, after all, isn't the only MMO doing this. And I don't just mean in the half-related tangential sense I was describing with World of Warcraft. No, Blizzard has outright done this, using both its modern retail client as well as its old-school classic version. Last year, Retail WoW saw Mists of Pandaria Remix, a mode that is undeniably inspired by old-school RuneScape's leagues. In Mists of Pandaria Remix, players found themselves locked to a continent of a prior expansion with expedited experience rates, somewhat unique drops, and an endless power scale. Classic WoW, which is an earlier incarnation of World of Warcraft running on a recreation of the systems present in 2006, also saw the Season of Discovery release, a version of Classic that had subscribers play through the game in level increments, as the developers capped the maximum level every patch and released a small raid created using assets from pre-existing dungeons. Alongside this, to expand on the Discovery in its name, they implemented a rune system, adding unlockable runes that grant player power as abilities and passives that can be discovered through a host of different methods, from secrets to quests to just killing bosses, somewhat similar to League's 3 in RuneScape called Shattered Relics. The reason I'm placing these two versions of seasonal game modes side by side is because Blizzard, in all of its creativity, has unintentionally just created or recreated the retail version of World of Warcraft, the one I spent a little bit of time explaining at the beginning of the video, and they recreated it again and again and again. So to understand what sets RuneScape apart from these games, we first need to analyze what these games do, and unfortunately, releasing a short-form seasonal piece of content for a short-form seasonal game doesn't make much sense. You're essentially just making the same game, except now it's a little less begotten to competitive balance, balance being an explicit flaw of retail WoW, not due to a lack of it, but rather due to Blizzard's incessant need to overbalance. They put themselves in the confounding position of needing to hyperfixate on balancing an MMORPG to support its high level of competitive difficulty imposed by them, and as a result removing all of the fun and uniqueness out of the game's progression systems. This manifests as simplistic, homogenized systems with identical stat blocks, a sauceless trinket system that somehow makes unique on-use items feel weak and samey, and of course a general disregard for gearing and itemization as a whole. Thankfully, that doesn't all apply to Pandaria Remix, at least not conceptually, a version of retail WoW that was thankfully less concerned with balance and more concerned with power progression. This was mainly done through the use of infinite power scaling on rather boring items. Season of Discovery, however, is a much more curious failure, and I want to use that word carefully because it's not a bad game. There are people who swear by it. The discussion is what fascinates me. Classic WoW on the surface is begging for this kind of content. In addition, Blizzard is all too content in re-releasing the game over and over again, so upon seeing this Season of Discovery, I, alongside others, was surprised. New content? Blizzard? That's shocking. While I wasn't in the camp expecting it to become a Classic Plus, a pipe dream for Stockholm Classic WoW players who think Blizzard will hire 100-odd developers to expand on the pre-existing Classic game, I was at least intrigued by where it could go in theory. Wise. Classic Plus was the core of the discussion, and one I will not delve too deeply into here because it likely deserves its own video, but judging by the direction taken in Season of Discovery, whatever Classic Plus could be or would be is nowhere near what Classic WoW is or should be. Season of Discovery, or SOD, capitalized on a single intelligent observation by the small development team tasked with creating it. The Classic Beta from half a decade ago, where thousands of players got to play Classic WoW before its release in 2019 up to a limited level cap, was engaged in a rather unique way. What happened was a host of large content creators created their own content, braved their own challenges, and explored a world alongside their fans in an emergent way. They didn't just rush to max level and then do the simple raids and dungeons. They made their own game locked to level 30, enormous PvP battles, taking 40-odd players to fight some random high-level elite, and so on. With that in mind, the SOD developers stitched together a similar concept. What if patches evolving the Season of Discovery would start at level 20 rather than level 60, the original max level? What if at level 20, players can band together and face a new challenge? Again, on its surface, this is awesome. Unfortunately, and perhaps expectedly, it wasn't, and that was clear almost immediately, as I discovered after obtaining my very first rune, giving my character an ability from a future expansion. In fact, most runes are just abilities and passives from future expansions, so what you end up getting is a version of a specialization that resembles something that already exists. What's to discover about that? Admittedly, there are more unique options such as a mage healer, but those are few and far between. Even more damning, this was far from the main issue. What WoW developers have been trained to do for years now is to create a very specific kind of content, instanced content, raids, dungeons, battlegrounds. Gone are the days where the overworld takes precedent over that, because those days were almost exclusively before vanilla WoW even launched in 2004. Most of the developers who created the world that so many players fondly remember and still to this day fondly experience are no longer influences on the game. Therefore, what was given in SOD is a new small raid at level 20. Cool, but not classic. Raids were never the core appeal of classic WoW. Dungeons were never the core appeal of classic WoW. That has never and will never be the most evocative element of the game. It's always been the world. And the fact that the developers releasing the Season of Discovery ended up spending their development time creating linear instanced raids is, well, there is no eloquent way to express how bizarre and disconnected this choice was. The leveling experience is the meat and content of classic WoW. The endgame is a host of incredible emergent systems intertwined with mundane instanced content. That content only succeeds on the back of interpersonal emergent experiences, running out to get your world buffs, the loot drama, the cross-guild or cross-faction collusion, the backstabbing and management of 40-odd players in a single raid. That becomes the endgame of Classic, not Molten Core again. Foregoing all of that in favor of a level 20 dungeon meta raid is, well, it's as if they hired plumbers to perform a colonoscopy. You end up with confusion and a lot of shit. I don't want to devalue the hard work of these developers or even attribute negative intentions. The new raids aren't bad when compared to other classic raids, and I truly believe it's what they had the time to do and what they were taught to do. And the players aren't there to even explain this issue either, as when we analyze what is asked for within a fictitious Classic Plus, all players seem to want is more dungeons and raids and perhaps some new endgame zones, unintentionally just asking for expansions in a roundabout sort of way. SOD is just retail WoW with micro expansions. The level cap is bumped up every few months with a new raid awaiting those who rush through the rapid leveling experience and a host of new items that surely devalue those preceding them. In fact, they even expedite the leveling to assist those who want to catch up. Catch up to what? One raid? Mustard? I struggle to understand how this is in the spirit of a game that evokes its world and therefore what one does within it, and what that world begets in the original vanilla or even the classic release is emergent systems. Again, this deserves its own video. What these two attempts at seasonal game modes showcase is both a lack of understanding and perhaps more sadly, an impossibility. Making a seasonal game mode out of a seasonal game is almost paradoxical, and the version that could benefit from something seasonal ended up just becoming that which it sought to avoid. Now, finally, let's look at Leagues. Strangely, Leagues opposes the main version of Oldschool Runescape immediately. As I zoned in for the first time, met with hundreds of players, a sense of speed gripped me. I felt, intentionally or not, like I needed to go fast, and if I didn't, I would miss out on something intangible. This could be as a result of what I was witnessing in front of me, the weeks of min-max conversations prior to the launch, or just the understanding that this is a limited time game mode. The long-term progression that acts as RuneScape's most defining feature is no longer here. I had 8 weeks to do what I could and not a second more. At the time, that felt daunting. Looking back, 8 weeks is more than enough because the progression was multiplicatively increased as you begin to interact with the core mechanic of leagues, the tasks. If the first thing you do in OSRS upon leaving Tutorial Island is quests, the first thing you do in leagues is tasks. An odd synonym really. These tasks are strangely similar to standard MMO questing. They are singular tiered directives that upon completion grant leagues points, which are like your secondary experience used to unlock regions and relics. There is also a second set of tasks that grant the combat masteries as well, but those are essentially account milestones, defeating the area-specific Echo Boss, for example, braving one of the more difficult challenges like the Inferno, and so on. Much like my experience loading into OSRS a year ago, I haplessly meandered for a moment, trying to regain my footing, but unlike the main game, this was like regaining footing in the middle of a Black Friday stampede. Except in the stead of high-heeled wine moms, it was pink skirt donning gamers. I'm not sure what's worse. There was a level of novel excitement with that. Lumbridge was bustling and chaotic, a serene, nostalgic landscape transformed into a din. My group Ironman partner and I felt enraptured by the speed, even though we were guideless, so we improvised our own meta, involving mistaking regions, misunderstanding tasks, and almost dying in the stronghold of security twice. The process of earning points was incredibly satisfying though, offering bursts of progression, reminding you that you were moments away from a new relic, mastery, item, reward. But of course, this is not without its flaws, one of which is a UI that has, over time, become more and more stuffed with sub-menus leading into more sub-menus. Something I hope will be alleviated with the upcoming integration of an official Jagex client is the use of screen space provided by said client. The pop-out widget-driven section of RuneLite, for example, would be a perfect place to implement certain UI functions that are otherwise a chore to navigate through. The most essential of which is the task menu itself, a new tab placed beside the quests and achievements section of the UI. Upon clicking this menu, a pop-up which covers most of your screen appears, and then you must filter that pop-up to find appropriate tasks for yourself. This is untenable. All the second monitor gamers, such as myself, surely just had a wiki open on the other monitor, but that in and of itself is also untenable. It's an unclean solution leveraging a community's commitment to creating the best wiki of any game ever to alleviate a problem inherent to the UI. I hope to see this remedied with the official Jagex client. Give us the opportunity to sort, track, and filter tasks in a widget-driven system like RuneLite has. Why not? A trend of issues with leagues generally manifest as a simple user experience problem, which is why leagues, to me, is almost shockingly popular. The player count surges, new and returning players join the choir of eager taskers, but leagues is an unbelievably unfriendly experience to new players. It's confusing, offering even less guidance than the main game does, and creating strange points of unintuitive design that already familiar players will never even encounter. Thankfully, that's why I'm here. One of the earliest issues encountered was the X marks the spot quest, a very early game quest granting a small experience lamp as a reward, an obvious goal to do in leagues. But you can't do it. You can start it, but you can't complete it, as it requires a different region than those which you have access to in the beginning. There is no mention of this anywhere in the game. You are just kind of expected to know that. You can't even sort by region when looking at completed or completable quests. You are just expected to know that. This problem, once again, can be fixed with more consideration in designing the UX. Why give the option to start quests that aren't even completable, just for those min-maxing their region rushes? If so, then why not implement a warning that this quest requires a different region to even complete? Don't get me wrong, these are small problems and only encountered by new players who aren't glued to their second monitor following a guide, but alleviating them nonetheless creates more incentive to not follow a guide, to blaze your own trail and be the architect of your own mistakes. Fun aside, it's a core reason why Leagues truly isn't a new player-friendly recruitment tool. It is likely to push more new players away than it isn't. What we see in new player engagement is as a result of hype that can otherwise be generated with other forms of content, rather than a game mode that may confuse more than it doesn't. That's not to say a new player can't wrangle it, but pre-existing knowledge to me is borderline paramount for enjoyment. Thankfully, enjoyment is at the forefront when this knowledge exists. Leagues is just so fun, and that is where I can honestly end the video. It's so fun, in fact, that I maxed my stats. So fun that I played it twice, once on my main Group Ironman account and another time on a different account to experience new regions and a new build. There is a level of intelligent design present that once again elevates Oldschool Runescape's development team handedly above others in the MMO space. They are tasked with balancing a complicated, deep world and implementing systems on top of pre-existing ones in a way to enhance rather than diminish. It would be very easy to overshadow existing content by rushing players through it. Instead, Leagues emphasizes that content. Inferior design would see a flood of resources to alleviate troubles with, say, herblore and farming, or mining and smithing. What if every enemy dropped 50 noted Raynars because prayer pots can slow the rush to endgame? But instead, these hurdles remain because that is what breeds innovative gameplay and this kind of emphasized content, and that is most prevalent with the new Echo bosses. These enhanced encounters are unlocked through killing the normal versions a few times and receiving an Echo Orb, which, when held, can be used to unlock a private instanced version of that encounter. This version of the fight has reworked mechanics to provide a bigger challenge. But Echo fights did so much more than just provide that. Again, there is a level of intelligent design here that is easy to appreciate. My first encounter was the Grotesque Guardians in the Mauritania region. My second region unlocked since my first one, Varlamore, featured the most difficult Echo boss, so I avoided it for the time being. Grotesque Guardians are an old Slayer boss, meaning that they are, at best, somewhat boring and at worst, about what one expects from an old Slayer boss. Grinding out the first kills on the normal versions wasn't particularly fun because my melee-centric build performed great on the melee boss, but the moment I swapped to range, I was back playing the main game. Slow, inaccurate attacks, and an overall arduous experience. To be frank, I was nervous for the Echo version, not just the difficulty, but what the lack of range strength could mean for my experience. But I really shouldn't have doubted this team, because the Echo boss opened the fight up rather than honing in on its most frustrating elements. The main gargoyle is at the center, the melee version, flanked by two other gargoyles which can be killed separately for a slower, safer fight, or ignored for a more difficult and quick fight. I, not knowing this, focused only the main gargoyle. What was immediately clear to me was that the changes made are in an effort to make a more intuitive encounter out of this rather old and outdated experience. Suddenly, the telegraphs made more sense, like the falling rocks on the fight now striking one tile like their shadow actually indicates, rather than the surrounding tiles as well, like in the main encounter. Damage can now actually be avoided, rather than it being an unavoidable byproduct of the final phase, with most of the skill expression of this Echo variant being around maximizing uptime on the main gargoyle while avoiding all the surrounding AoE. It was hectic, but so fun, and at no point did it require me to switch to my rather weak range setup. Best of all, this encounter was faster as well. What ended up happening is that an old encounter was just made better. It was faster, more intuitive, the mechanics were clearer and more concise, and the pace was much more engaging. And while I truly love the grotesque guardians in their Echo variant, this positive change to old fights was at its true peak in the desert with the Calphite Queen, a region I unlocked on my secret second account. The Calphite Queen was completely transformed from one of the most perfunctory, frustrating, underdone, outdated, bad encounters into a modern, fun, early to mid-game fight that demanded attention and precise movement. To say that this was an improvement would be an understatement. It was a rework. But I do fear for the poll, which may eventually ask for this fight to be implemented into the main game, because for all of the evolution of the OSRS community, there is still a rigid bastion of players who see a lot of value in preserving terrible, awful, pointless shit for no reason other than it's old and makes their nostalgia sparkle when they do it every few years. The current Calphite Queen offers very, very minimal value to the game. It acts as a frustration for those pursuing the elite tasks in the desert and a frustration for those eager to get all their collection logs from the boss. And that's it. There really is no other pleasure in doing the fight. The Echo variant, however, is the opposite, and I hope that Jagex and voting players see this. It's not all sunshine and good design with Echo bosses, however. Ironically, the better fights in the main game suffer more in their Echo variants, the most prominent of which is Echo Soul, the final boss of the Colosseum. The format is great, allowing players to skip the prior waves and just challenge him. But this fight wasn't reworked because it didn't need to be. The main version of Soul is already awesome. As a result, what the Echo version really became is just Soul with more stuff. And on top of that, healing totems spawn all around the arena in increments of health. I hate these healing totems. Not only are their hitboxes really not good, they also break up the pacing of the fight that is all about pacing. Soul is a flow state driven encounter, and the spawning of these totems drags your attention away, creating a secondary distraction that honestly detracts from the encounter itself. I would have much rather seen newer attack combinations to throw players off, or even crazier patterns to avoid. With all that said, much like any RuneScape player, my eyes were set on the prize, in this case, the Echo items. These are unique items which drop from individual bosses, opening up new and alternative pathways to dealing tons of damage. My personal favorite actually coming from Soul himself, as you are now able to wield his spear and shield combo and gain one of the coolest special attacks in the entire game, a weapon that I genuinely miss in the main game. These items were by and large hits. I hope that in future leagues they continue to expand on the Echo bosses in each region, as well as adding new Echo bosses in the first regions as well. The coolest element of combat in leagues was actually the utilization of new items, with only the jewelry from the Dagonoth Kings falling flat in excitement since they were just glorified stat sticks. I would much rather have jewelry with unique and impactful effects on them rather than granting a few max hits and some accuracy. Leagues can and should be a testing ground, one that could have alleviated the issues with, say, the least done region, Kandarin. Stuffed into the corner of the world map, this region ceased to offer anything particularly important since access to the most powerful melee prayer, Piety, was now possible with a relic power, and a better piece of magic damage jewelry was obtainable from the Dagonoth Kings. As a result, Kandarin wasn't done, and if we are to look at Leagues 5 in a vacuum, that's for the better because it offers bad content, boring bosses, mediocre grinds, and just a dearth of interesting shit. In the future, if they were to spend more time on the region, it could very well become a bastion for magic damage once more. One of the most surprisingly ignored features by Jagex was the elemental weaknesses, a wonderful early game update released in 2024 that made elemental spells more worthwhile on certain creatures weak to their associated element. Unfortunately, all this really did was give more use for elemental spells in the early game, but elemental spells were already used in the early game. In fact, that's the only time they were ever really used. What was a potentially exciting rollout was muted by Jagex just forgetting about this entire system, which sucked because magic as a combat skill is really unfun. It is defined by a single item that just so happens to be the most expensive and rare magic item in the entire game, and everything else just feels really underwhelming and bad to use. Quite frankly, what I was hoping for was not only a more expansive release of weaknesses, but also new items that really enhance the use of these spells in certain situations. Why not allow us to use the runecrafting skill, for example, one of, if not the most hated skills in the entire game, to imbue certain pieces of jewelry with loads of elemental runes to add elemental damage properties to them? Why not give us the opportunity to create elemental damage builds? Because the most confounding element of Kandarin as a region was that its unique echo item was one for elemental damage, an item that seemed to have been teleported from an alternate dimension where elemental weaknesses had any use whatsoever anywhere other than the early game, a rare yet poignant miss from Jagex. Leagues also served an alternate purpose for me. While my group Ironman partner and I ventured into Leagues without guides, we did so with the knowledge that we want to experience content that we were planning to do in the main game shortly. This was the Colosseum as well as the second raid, the Theater of Blood. One of the most oft-cited reasons for League's success is its ability to give existing players the opportunity to experience content they may be unwilling to or too afraid to try in the main game. And Leagues does allow for this. After 50-odd clears of the Theater of Blood, hard mode included, I feel much more confident with stepping into the encounters in the main game, if only because I have now seen what the mechanics are. And that's an important note. Seeing mechanics is of course a positive, but the way one does them is often totally different. One of the rudest awakenings post-Leagues was hopping into the Colosseum for the first time and realizing that the waves are a lot harder than Leagues made them out to be, and while I am very confident on Soul, wave solving was really not something even truly required in Leagues. You could very easily brute force the entire process. And quite frankly, it's hard to resist, especially with the Last Stand relic giving you a second life every 3 minutes. In this sense, Leagues is like a film degree. It is what you make of it, and to learn this content, you truly have to put yourself in the position to learn. That was my experience with the Inferno and my film degree, having accidentally hopped into the pit while readying myself for a day of learning before sleep. I figured, why not stay up for a bit longer and just see what I could do? I ended up clearing it in one try, because I had what I didn't in the main game, the Sunlight Spear, which had the positive effect of being able to one-shot just about every single enemy in the Inferno without needing to do any wave solve at all. Even Zuck, while intense thanks to my weaker range build, was relatively easy because it is at no point representative of the main game. Overall, Leagues was an incredible experience and one that I am honestly eager to see evolve over the years. If what Jagex said holds to be true, then Leagues ought to be the iterative, growing seasonal game mode that expands with every new release, creating an almost secondary alternative experience to the main game. But that's not to say that it should be permanent. Leagues only works because it's time limited. Actually, time limited. It's flitting, disappearing in an instant, and working in tandem with the main game while being meaningfully different. It is an experience buoyed by the contextual understanding of the functions in the main version. Items, experience rates, just about everything relies on prior knowledge. Leagues only functions as a byproduct of knowing what the real game is like. Pulling a mega rare so effortlessly is only exciting and silly because you know how rare that item really is. It's almost a secondary moment of joy seeing what takes hundreds of hours to obtain in the main game being grinded in the span of a single night. That is the value. On its own or being permanent, Leagues would lose that feeling outright, and all you are left with is a game that's chewed through in a week and forgotten about forever. But Leagues would never be permanent, right? But what if it was? What if Jagex hired an entire team to develop a secondary architecture that would give players the opportunity to create their own leagues, their own miniature worlds, microcosms of something more, an emptied simulacra? That is Project Zanaris. At its current scope, Jagex seeks to deliver a paid private server experience with various parameters allowing players to adjust experience rates, drops, region restrictions, and so on. It is a gutted, simplistic version of the possibilities in leagues. They hope to eventually implement some element of player modding to allow for more transformative creations as well. I am unsure what to make of this development. I am fearful of the effect a permanent sect of private servers can have on the perceived value of reward in the main game. It is far less exciting conceptually to pull a Scythe of Vitter from the Theater of Blood when you have a private server right there where you can spawn it on the floor and use it at your whim. It is less exciting because it makes the main game an experience recontextualized, not a new experience altogether. I believe that MMOs are defined by communal perception. An item is only worth what it is deemed to be worth, and an achievement is similar. Take a look at Skillcape in RuneScape's modern incarnation, RuneScape 3, in which a host of poor monetization decisions have led the game to have an integrity spiral. Experience is buyable, and as a result, achievements from experience are no longer perceived as anything really. Skill capes aren't just meaningless because they take less time, they're meaningless because they are indistinguishable from the cash shop. They have become in-game fixtures of a monetization model. But this issue extends to old school RuneScape as well. While it has overall far more integrity as a game, bonds have severely damaged that for those not playing the Iron Man game mode. They have brought to question what someone has and hasn't earned, and again, in a world defined by communal perceptions, that has negatively impacted incentives. Personal achievements are personal in personal environments, but are intrinsically not in group environments. What may motivate someone to strive for an Infernal Cape is as much personal achievement as the clout of having such a prestigious item. The more the prestige is diminished, the less likely someone is to put themselves through the many hours it requires to learn such a piece of content. This does, as much as we may not like it to, heavily connect with Project Zanaris because this selection of private servers is legally and with intent connected to the main game. Not literally, but conceptually. And as we know, games with vibrant modding scenes are defined by those modding scenes. Minecraft, Skyrim, Fallout, and even tangential scenes like that of The Witcher and Dark Souls. These games undeniably have had their lifespans extended thanks to a vibrant modding community, but the main game's prominence in the public conscious diminishes the larger the associated mods are. I am unsure how this impacts an MMO, as this is in many ways uncharted territory. It could become a successful secondary engagement system, a forgotten relic, or an overshadowing Leviathan that shifts most of Jagex's focus on upkeep and monetizing what have become fractured incarnations of old-school RuneScape. That is dependent on the tools provided, of course, which right now are so limited as to not generate much interest at all. What is at stake if that were to happen is a game that is not only singular in its long-form architecture, a modern rarity in the MMO space, but also a hub for everyone. Because what seasonal and limited short-form game modes lack is a permanence in their community's conscious. Leagues, for all of its merits and joy, is forgotten about before it even concludes. That life cycle of what is a separate entity is very much representative of the life cycle of every single patch of every single theme park MMO. To refer to World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV again, these patches or expansions launch with exuberant fanfare and player numbers spike to double or even triple what they were prior to launch, and then plummet down not 2 months afterward, with smaller spikes with patch releases. When compared to old-school RuneScape's more steady growth over time, the flaws of this are demonstratively clear. Why play during a lull? Why not wait until a new patch? This doesn't apply to RuneScape, but it does apply to leagues. If you aren't playing after the first week, well, I guess better luck next year. Seasonality within gaming as a whole, even in the MMO space, exists in more than just the name. A trend that I would call seasonal, yet inhabits a totally different title, is relaunching. A popular cash-in for less successful MMOs that still have a nostalgic user base reminiscing on the quote-unquote good old days by just relaunching a classic version for a beat or two and letting it die out. This can be seen with games like Arcade, which filtered through a few game resets and relaunches that lasted not more than a few months before petering out into obscurity once more. Seasonal systems can also be seen with games like Black Desert Online that implemented them in a similar fashion to Fresh Start Worlds and RuneScape 3, two games that have their unique merits but are flawed due to microtransactions robbing them of their integrity. These seasonal servers exist as catch-up systems with expedited experience rates and item acquisition that, upon completion, put these seasonal characters into the main game, having rushed past what is deemed to be less relevant content. Seasonal structures exist in so many titles at this point that they have become a ubiquitous facet of all live service games. And in the MMO space, Oldschool RuneScape once again managed to blaze a trail like it did in its release in 2013, leading into its own personal development in 2015. It has inspired other titles, which took what they could, but of course failed to mimic the actual benefit of having a proper game contextualizing the seasonal experience. They may recreate the flitting enjoyment, but will never be able to recreate the permanent home.